Please note that the views expressed on this program are those of the individuals who speak them, and not necessarily those of Portsmouth Community Radio, its Board of Trustees, members, volunteers, or underwriters. Good evening and welcome to Spirit Radio. I am your host, Willie Hassell. Along with my co-host, Lynn Nickerson, we will take you on a journey into the unknown, where the paranormal becomes the normal. A journey to a world cloaked in darkness, where reality becomes a thin veil. So sit back, relax, and join us as we venture into the shadows, the darkness, the unknown, and back. Okay, and good evening once again, and welcome to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. This is the show where the paranormal becomes the normal. I am your host, Willie Hassell, your gatekeeper to the dark side, your guide to the realm of the unknown, the unseen, the unthinkable. And she is always the lovely, she is always the mystical, she is the mysterious, and fortunately she is always here. And she is Lynn Nickerson. Good evening.
Good evening, Willie. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing today?
Not bad. I think we're pretty much all prepared here.
I think we are.
We have a very interesting guest.
Yes, we have a very special guest tonight.
Very lucky to have him.
We are. We're happy to have him. And so shall we go ahead
without further ado?
Get right to it, and I will introduce him.
Okay.
Okay. Our guest tonight is Dr. Robert M. Schoch. He has been a full-time faculty member at the College of General Studies at Boston University since 1984. He earned his Ph.D. in geology and geophysics at Yale University in 1983. And he also holds a B.A. in anthropology and a B.S. in geology from George Washington University. In the early 90s, Dr. Schoch stunned the world with his revolutionary research that recast the date of the Great Sphinx of Egypt to a period thousands of years earlier than its standard attribution. Dr. Schoch revealed to the world that mankind's history is far older than previously believed. He is also an author of several books, his latest being Forgotten Civilization, the role of solar outbursts in our past and future, which we'll be discussing tonight, and it is an honor to welcome him to the show. Good evening, Dr. Schoch.
Good evening, Dr. Schoch.
Hello. I'm pleased to be here, but I have to tell you I can barely hear your voices.
Okay, we'll try and speak up for you. Is that working any better?
I'm pleased to hear you. I think I heard an introduction.
You did?
Oh, okay. For some reason, we get that a lot. Apparently, over the phone, we just, the volume isn't too good. Can you hear us okay now?
I can hear it just a little bit better.
All right.
I'll try to focus and listen as carefully as possible.
All right. We'll make an effort to speak up and raise our voices. I was just going to briefly summarize your book because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are not aware of what it's about. So I thought I'd just mention that there are a lot of great civilizations far earlier than previously thought, and sites existed that predate the generally accepted high civilization of Egypt, which is believed to have been around 3,500 BC or 5,500 years ago. So in your book, you explore how near the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,700 years ago, that a solar outburst caused a series of events that wiped out civilization at that time. And you defend this high likelihood by looking at the evidence from geological, geophysical, and anthropological perspectives. And you also predict that there's a high probability for an imminent repeat performance. So, would you like to segue into that?
Well, yeah, you gave a bit of a summary there, and I appreciate that. I've been doing this for 25 years now. What I mean by that is I first got involved with Egypt, looking at the origins of civilization in 1990. That was my first trip to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found there, and this is what got me started on this path, I found that the Great Sphinx, everyone knows about the Great Sphinx. It's absolutely iconic, arguably the greatest statue
In the world,
at this
really.
point, the largest statue from ancient times, at least, that exists in the world, freestanding carved stone statue. And the traditional date for that is 2500 BC. So my geological analysis, as I think the listeners heard, I have a PhD from Yale in geology and geophysics. I applied geological analysis to the Sphinx and found that the core body, the oldest portion, dates back at least several thousand years earlier. So this was early 1990s. This set me on the path of looking at civilization, very early civilization. And as I believe you rightfully summarized, the classical point of view is that civilization arose about 3500 BC in places like Egypt, in places like Mesopotamia, also actually in the Far East in China, but about 3500 BC, 5,500 years ago. And what my dating initially suggested is that was not correct, that it takes a civilization to carve something like the Great Sphinx, even what I call the Proto-Sphinx. And not only did they carve the Sphinx, but they carved out simultaneously huge limestone blocks weighing tens of tons, which they used to build a temple in front of the Sphinx. This is still in existence. You can track today. In fact, I'll be taking some people to Egypt in January. If people are interested, they can go to my website and look up the details and join me. It's not too...
Oh, that sounds really interesting.
But this started me on the path, and there were lots of naysayers, especially in my academic community. The Egyptologists said this was absolutely impossible, but I have been developing that data ever since, and now we have other sites around the world which confirm that civilization went back not just thousands of years earlier than 3500 BC, but actually to the end of the last ice age. Civilization, or what I call an early cycle of civilization, existed. We now have very strong evidence that it existed before the end of the last ice age, that is before 9700 BC. I want to give one quick example of that. The most dramatic example is the site called the Bekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which is incredibly sophisticated, huge monolithic structures. It makes Stonehenge look like a primitive child's play in comparison. Because they're beautifully carved. There are beautiful sculptures that come from the site. And the thing is, if you looked at it and you didn't know what you were looking at, if we didn't have very good radiometric control on it, very good geologic and stratigraphic control on it, one would think it's maybe 1000 BC or something like that. It turns out that it actually is 9 to 10,000 BC. Again, another site confirming what I've been saying for all these decades, that there was a civilization, there was a cycle of civilization at a much earlier period, and you just summarized it too. And we can go into more detail on all of this as you like. But a big question is, if there was this earlier civilization or cycle of civilizations, what happened to them? And that is what I've determined most recently, that it was a major solar outburst, which not only caused the dramatic warming we see at the end of the last ice age, melted the glaciers, caused torrential rains, because when you melt incredible amounts of water, it gets into the atmosphere, it overloads the atmosphere, has to come down as precipitation. With a major solar outburst, you would have had, if you saw it at that time, people would have seen what would have looked like, in some cases, huge lightning bolt type structures, or what would look like huge lightning bolts hitting the surface of the Earth. They would have caused forest fires. They would cause what's known as vitrification, or the melting of surface rock, which then turns glassy when it congeals. very quickly. We have evidence of all of this. It
Like
would have
obsidian?
caused, things like catastrophic earthquakes, because when you release so much pressure of ice at high latitudes, the Earth rebounds and causes earthquakes. It would have caused increased volcanic activity. We know this geologically for similar reasons. Torrential rains, as I mentioned, flooding, rising sea levels. And we have now records of this among the legends of the ancient civilizations, among what are known as petroglyphs, which record what people were seeing in the sky, which no one has known how to interpret previously. Even on Easter Island, which my wife Katie and I have been studying, and she actually recognized that the so-called Rongo script of Easter Island records this also, as do their legends. So we're really putting together, I would say, a new view of the origins of civilization and the fact that there was civilization before civilization is supposed to have existed.
If I could ask you,
conventional thinking. It goes back much earlier, and that early civilization was devastated by these natural events, went into what I'm now calling SIDA, or solar-induced dark age, before the reemergence of civilization.
do you suppose that Atlantis was part of this? I know it seems in some camps it's very mythological, but do you believe that Atlantis existed and that its demise was...
Yes. Atlantis is a very, very pertinent point. What I find the evidence to indicate at this point is not so much... Let me put it this way. I have been reading Plato, and I've been aware of Atlantis since I was at least 12 years old. I consciously remember that far back reading Plato. And many people sort of chase Atlantis, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but what they are really focused on is finding Atlantis. Where was Atlantis? Was it in the Atlantic Ocean? Was it in Spain? Was it in the Mediterranean? Was it in Indonesia? Was it Antarctica? I think that is not the major point that we need to take into account. I think what we need to take into account now is the chronology that Plato sets out when he talks about Atlantis. He is very clear and very specific that this was a high civilization, a sophisticated civilization that existed in our terms. So if you put it into modern chronology, approximately 9600 BC. That is explicitly what Plato says, and I do not believe it's coincidental at all that the best geological dating for the end of the last ice age is within a century of Plato's recounting, within a century of Plato's chronology, and he talks about Atlantis being devastated by these natural catastrophes, which I think, when you put it into a legend and a myth that has been passed down for millennia, it is a very good description of what we now know geologically happened at the end of the last ice age.
Yes.
So I've become, if you want to say, a believer in Atlantis in that sense.
Oh, good. Glad to hear that. Getting to Easter Island, I know that you and your wife went there and you got married there. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was quite an event being married on Easter Island.
Yeah, that must be
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. The people are so wonderful there. They're so friendly.
That must have been a really cool place to get married. I got to say that.
Yeah. It just worked out. It worked out. It was serendipitous, I suppose.
Well, I had several questions about Easter Island. A couple of them focusing on the Moai. What do you suppose their purpose was, and why do you suppose that they seem to be found all around the perimeter of the island as if they're standing sentinel?
Yeah, they are standing sentinel. One could put it that way. They are, and I was looking at this specifically when I was last on Easter Island. We've been there a couple of times, and it's very hard to tell because the Moai have been reconstructed. They were all knocked down by the middle or late 19th century, unfortunately. But they've been reconstructed to the best of archaeologists' ability, putting them into the correct positions. It is known that all the Moai around the perimeter of the island, there are also some in the center, so that's not the ones we're talking about now. The ones on the perimeter face inland. They face into the island. A lot of people who have not been there, they think they actually face out to the ocean. No, they face into the island. And secondly, when I look at their eye sockets, because they're missing their eyes now.
That's right.
Over the years. But when you look at their eye sockets and try to figure out what direction they're looking in,
they're looking up.
Look up. They look up. And the Easter Islanders have these legends of things happening in the sky in ancient times. They also have legends of times being so horrible on the surface of Earth that they had to go underground. The Easter Islanders spent time underground in caves. There's lots of natural caves as well as artificially. Well, they would take caves and then they would expand them artificially. Plus, on Easter Island, they have these strange, they call them houses, that look sort of like fallout shelters or bunkers.
Yeah.
So the Easter Islanders have this long tradition that there were times that they had to go sort of underground. They had to escape whatever was happening. They have this legend that was independently documented decades ago when no one was talking about the things I'm talking about, solar events, which I believe when you read the legend, they talk about the sky falling literally, and I believe it's a very good description of what would happen during a solar event.
Do you suppose the Moai were...
the Rongo script, as I mentioned briefly already, seems to describe, or seems to have been inspired, is the way I should say it, by the images literally that you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst. People know about the Aurora Borealis, or the Northern Lights, Aurora Australis. If I could say that.
Aurora Borealis.
Australis, the Southern Lights. And you see these at high latitude. Now it has to do with the solar wind and small solar outbursts hitting the upper atmosphere, hitting the magnetosphere, and it takes on little shapes. When you have a major solar event, not only do you see these at lower latitudes and potentially around the world, but they take on much more diagnostic shapes, much more better defined, if I could put it that way, shapes, and they will look literally like sort of stick figures in the sky dancing around, sort of human stick figures or stick figures with birds' heads on them. In Easter Island, there's a long tradition of a Birdman cult. In fact, this is something we find around the world, which, people have never, in my assessment, been able to explain cogently. Why do you have these traditions of bird-headed men? Well, in fact, that is what you would see in the sky, or that's what it would look anthropomorphically to us.
Wouldn't you think then the Birdman culture was developed after they had seen the plaza and made the depictions in stone, and then time passed, no one really knew the significance, but they thought perhaps it was sacred or shamanic, and they developed a cult from that?
Yes, I think something along those lines. And what you have to understand, too, is that when you have a major outburst like this, it actually would come in several waves over, you'd have the first one, and then there'd be several waves that would come, and this would be a dramatic thing. People would pass down the stories. They would, as you said, depicted in engravings, depicted in other artistry, art forms. They would have legends about it. But more importantly, they would remember how those that survived were able to escape by going underground, by going into caves.
Well,
and what do you do, especially when this is fresher, should we say, not that many generations away? you would be concerned that this might happen again, so you would make potential preparations.
Well,
I sometimes use the analogy when I'm talking to people about this, the analogy of the Cold War in the United States, when everyone was worried about the Soviet Union attacking us and dropping nuclear bombs. There were fallout shelters all over the place. People had them in their backyard.
yeah, they did.
Now it's almost become, I mean, we're talking only a few years, a few decades, but even now, sort of legends, or if you could think of myths evolving around that. So maybe thousands of years from now, would that turn into a myth when people have lost a lot of knowledge about it?
Mm-hmm. But why do you suppose they erected the moai then? It must have been subsequent to the outburst, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it was subsequent to the outburst, but I think it was sort of a memorial to it, and also a warning, if you could put it that way. I hate to sound
warning?
like a doomsayer, but that we better keep our attention and focus. Also, you know, I don't want to make any of these cultures to be sort of primitive and stupid, that type of thing, but there are religious impulses, and often religious impulses can be inspired by
Oh, sure.
you know, major natural events, natural
yeah.
catastrophes. I mean, they're all inspiring. I mean, think of the Judeo-Christian Bible, where things happen and it's seen as God's wrath, or it's seen as God's power.
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know, I think there's truth to that, honestly. And so, you know, you want to try to at least pay attention to it. You want to try to not forget, I'll put it that way.
Well, you know, getting back to the moai, do you suppose that they were, I mean, they're massive. Do you...
That there were what?
They're massive.
Oh, they're massive, absolutely.
Yes, so do you suppose that there actually was a race of giants? I know that in 1722 there was an expedition there, and they found that there were giants on the island, although
yes.
they weren't of great stature, but there were giants.
Yeah, the Dutch who are, I have some Dutch blood, so I'm going to say this. The Dutch can be very, very meticulous and careful. It was Dutch Admiral, actually, Jacob Roggeveen, who first discovered, in a Western sense, Easter Island, so in a modern Western sense, and they sighted it on Easter Sunday. That's why it's called Easter Island in English. And they reported firsthand accounts of giants cohabiting with more normal-sized people, should we say, on the island. They recorded that they were 12 feet tall for the men, that they were 10 feet tall
for
the women, that they could walk. The Dutch are not short people. Even back in the 18th century, they were not short. And they reported that they could walk between the legs of some of these. Now, three interesting points I'd like to make. One, I once mentioned this to archaeologists, and his response was, they were standing on stilts. Somehow, I don't think my ancestors were dumb enough to not recognize when someone was standing on stilts, especially when they're rowing out in canoes and that type of thing. I mean, you don't do that standing on stilts. I think they would have known if they were just standing on stilts. The second thing I wanted to mention is that we have, we've been to Easter Island a couple of times, and we've spoken to people who are native as you can be at this point on Easter Island. Everyone's a mixed blood at the moment, but we spoke to one person in particular who is an artist who knows anatomy, can distinguish human bones, and there have never been any large animals, to our knowledge, on Easter Island. And he said that, yes, he, as a child in particular, saw in a cave, that type of thing, large human bones. We'll call it giant human bones.
So they have been discovered. I was going to ask you that.
He was a modern eyewitness to what he claimed he saw, and I have no reason to doubt him. He wasn't making this up for my benefit. In fact, he didn't even know my interest at that point. The third point I want to make is that the Dutch also did a lot of, the Dutch in the 18th, 19th century were very enterprising when it came to travel, when it came to trade. they traded in the Dutch West Indies. The Dutch East Indies was now the region of Indonesia. And something they reported from Indonesia was that there was a race of very little people.
Right.
Essentially, you might call it, well, they call them hobbits nowadays.
Hobbits.
But little people that stood only about half as tall as them when they were fully adult, that they supposedly lived up in the mountains of some of the small islands. There's, hundreds of islands in Indonesia. And they would come down and raid the local villagers, and the local villagers told the Dutch about this. Now, what do modern scholars say, or what did they say? They say, well, this is nonsense. This is just tales that from the 18th and early 19th century. Obviously, there's nothing to it. There aren't little people, or maybe they were mistaking orangutans for little people, or who knows what, or some kind of monkey. Well, lo and behold, within just about 10 years ago now, fossils were found of a different species of human on Flores in Indonesia, where the adults stood only 3.5 feet high, or on that order. So, and they matched the descriptions of what the Dutch reported of these little people, and so now there's physical evidence that these there was in existence apparently a race, or it actually was a distinct species of human on the small side. So I point that out, that if the Dutch were correct there, maybe they were correct and will still be vindicated that there were giants on Easter Island.
Another thing that I'd like to discuss a little bit further is the Rongo text. We're approaching the bottom of the hour, Dr. Schoch. We're going to have to take a little break here for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll come right back on. So if you could hold on for just a moment.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. Supernatural Magazine, the UK's newest paranormal magazine, provides support to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. It is the magazine's goal to bring every aspect of supernatural news and research from around the world under one roof to create a universal platform for all those interested in the supernatural. More information is available at supernaturalmagazine.com. You are listening to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience on WSCA 106.1 FM, and we'll be right back after this short break. The video portion of Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience, is sponsored by Spirit Chasers Paranormal, a paranormal investigation and research organization in Northampton, New Hampshire. Professional, respectful, courteous. Check us out at spiritchasersparanormal.com or email Willie at spiritchasersparanormal.com.
Okay, you are listening to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience on WSCA 106.1 in Portsmouth's West End. And we do have a short underwriter announcement.
Programming on Portsmouth Community Radio is supported by you, our members, and by the Jeffrey E. Clark and Martha Fuller Clark Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation.
Okay, and with that, we shall go right back to the phone with our very special guest tonight, Dr. Robert Schoch.
Welcome back, Dr. Schoch. Can you hear us?
Hello?
Hi.
Hi,
Can you hear us?
We're back.
Oh, okay, we're back.
Welcome back.
Like I said, I can barely hear you.
Okay.
So we're back on air?
We're back on air.
We're going to have to talk to engineering about that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I think you were asking about the Rongo.
Right, and what the Rapa Nui think of it. Has anyone translated that? Do they know the significance of it?
No, so let me speak a little bit about the Rongo. The Rongo is this weird indigenous, we'll call it script. It's basically, the best way to describe it is it sort of looks like hieroglyphics. So it's not letters. It is little figures, if you would, little shapes, that type of thing. And the way that they recorded the Rongo and preserved it was on boards or pieces of wood, not even boards really. Wood is actually very rare and valuable on Easter Island because or trees growing on it. There's very little wood. They would even use driftwood as it would come to the island. The island itself is in the, it's really isolated in the Pacific, a little teeny island. So they had what they called the rongo carved into these wooden boards. Apparently there were hundreds of them when the island was first found or first contacted by Westerners, but with the missionaries in the 19th century, with Western contact, most of the rongo boards recording the rongo were destroyed. Apparently a lot of them were simply burnt at that point as firewood, that type of thing. So only about 26 or so people argue about which ones are authentic. About 26 have survived. So we know very little of the rongo. Interestingly, of the ones that have survived, there are big chunks that duplicate essentially the same hieroglyphics, if you would. So they seem to be copies or copies from an original source, that type of thing. There have been incredibly diverse attempts to try to translate it, to try to make sense of it. It doesn't seem to be directly related to any other script. It apparently is indigenous script just to the island, and it's really been considered one of the great
enigmas,
linguistic mysteries of the world. You know, different researchers, different linguists have come up with totally different interpretations of it. And what we think, and when I say we, Katie and myself, because Katie really discovered this, we think it refers to what you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst. So we were talking before the break very briefly, and I need to elaborate on this to tie it in with the rongo. We were talking about petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are ancient engravings on rock surfaces. And there's a Los Alamos National Laboratory physicist, plasma physicist, who studies things like major solar outbursts and what would occur during them. He studied this professionally. He's actually the world's expert, in my opinion, published major works on it since the early 1990s. And he himself, as a hobby, started looking at petroglyphs in the western region of the United States. And lo and behold, he found that these weird-looking petroglyphs that look sort of like stick figure humans, but they would have extra arms, they would have dots on the sides of their bodies, they would sometimes have bird head shapes, as I mentioned before, that this is actually what you would see in the sky, sort of like, it's hard to explain, sort of like lightning, but not exactly, in the sky during a major solar outburst. So I was actually studying those. I was studying his work. And then Katie, my wife, we'd gone to Easter Island. I was looking at the rongo like not everyone else, but like other scholars saying, well, there must be some sense to this. And she pointed out that, in fact, the characters of the rongo look a lot like the petroglyphs, and these very ancient petroglyphs, which in turn record what you would see during a major solar outburst. So we now believe that the rongo was inspired by the shapes of it record the differing shapes you would see during a major solar outburst and what you would have seen at the end of the last ice age. Now, I want to be very clear that the rongo tablets we have survived are, no one knows exactly how old they are, but they're not thousands of years old, or at least there's no indication, no evidence that they're thousands of years old, although, frankly, most of them have never been radiocarbon dated, that type of thing. But I don't believe they're that old. But what I do believe is that they are copies of copies of copies of copies, etc., just like Plato's works. We mentioned Plato and Atlantis before. We don't have anything original from Plato's time that he wrote. In fact, most of Plato's works the most we have is, maybe 1,000+ years old, but no one doubts that they are accurate recordings
All right. Well,
of what Plato wrote. So this seems to be what the Rongo Rongo is, and it was recording what was happening in that very, very ancient time in the sky.
in talking about translation, the Rapa Nui, they are of Polynesian descent. Is that right?
This is another big issue, actually. The Rapa Nui, and I love the Rapa Nui. Just so people know, Rapa Nui is the name of the island. It's actually a 19th century name, and they refer to themselves as the Rapa Nui, the people.
Mm-hmm.
One word for the people, two words for the island, but pronounced the same. Interestingly, the Easter Islanders, the Rapa Nui, were devastated once Westerners started coming to the island. Disease spread throughout the island. There were no one knows how many on the island in 1722 with the first Western contact, but best estimates are somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000, somewhere in that range. By one point in the 19th century, due to disease, due to slave raids, that type of thing, not virtually, a really high proportion of the population was essentially killed and died one way or another. So it got down to the number that's cited is usually 111 people.
Oh.
So absolutely devastated. And unfortunately, everyone's worth the same, of course, in one sense, but in another sense, a lot of the people, a higher proportion of the elite, the kings, we'll call it the educated, those that could understand or knew the meaning of the Rongo Rongo, that was all lost with them. There was no one surviving in the late 19th century that could, quote, read the Rongo Rongo. In some cases, the Chileans, Chile annexed Easter Island in the late 19th century, so it's now Chilean territory. The Chilean would ask the Easter Islanders, what does the Rongo Rongo mean? In a couple of cases, they would just sort of look puzzled, the Easter Islanders, the Rapa Nui, and then they would point to the skies. So it has something to do with something up there. So I think that, again, ties in with our hypothesis. I wanted to say, you mentioned Polynesians. The Rapa Nui now generally consider themselves Polynesians, that it's the easternmost corner of Polynesia, because their civilization essentially was wiped out, their culture was wiped out. In many ways, this is my commentary, they are trying to reconstruct their culture by incorporating lots of Polynesian aspects. Rapa Nui itself is a Polynesian name, which was not used for the island until, as I said, the 19th century. But just recently, for instance, there was a genetic study that was published. When I say just recently, within the last couple of years, I think the latest form I saw was published earlier this year, that shows that the genetics of the Rapa Nui people of the ancient Rapa Nui people includes not just Polynesian elements, but also South American elements.
Oh, that is interesting.
And this is something that Thor Heyerdahl had championed for decades. He's now deceased, but the famous Thor Heyerdahl from Kon-Tiki
fame, yeah.
Trips, he said, there's a South American element to Easter Islanders. Others denied that vehemently, but now there's genetic evidence backing that up, that there's a South American element to it also. Also on Easter Island, the classical view is that the Polynesians did not get there until very, very late, maybe only 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, because they have a scenario of the Polynesians moving throughout Polynesia from west to east. So since Easter Island is the easternmost island of Polynesia, it had to be colonized the latest. On the other hand, recent studies have shown that there's good evidence in the sense of plants that were brought to the island that would have been brought by humans, for instance, that are now found in the soil records, that no, humans were living on Easter Island much, much, much earlier, centuries, even millennia earlier than the traditional date. So, our I think, understanding of Easter Island, including the Rongo script, is really changing very rapidly.
Do you suppose there could be some connection, at least a language connection, because all of that area could have been part of Lemuria, and it must have been a basic language, way back then that it diversified, of course. But I should think they'd be able to find the descendants of some cognates in order to translate that Rongo strip. There's got to be something that is identifiable.
Yeah, in the language now, you have to distinguish the language from the Rongo, because the
It's
Rongo,
really glyphs.
as I was saying, is really a hieroglyphic script. Even if it was inspired, as I believe was the case based on the evidence, by solar outbursts in the sky, later it could have been put to more mundane uses as a writing instrument for more mundane things in some cases. But it doesn't really tell us the language per se. It's not an alphabetical type of language, so it's not a situation where you can reconstruct an ancient language from the Rongo. Now, that being said, the Rapa Nui language and what has apparently survived despite the devastation once there was European contact, yes, does seem to carry a lot of Polynesian-based terms, cognates, that type of thing. But there are also terms that seem to go to, tie in with South America, too, as I was mentioning, genetics is indicating. So I see, personally, Easter Island is a bit of a mixing bowl. What do they call it? A melting pot, as they sometimes say. And also, I suspect that wasn't just people coming to Easter Island in very ancient times, but going the other way, too. They were probably traveling back and forth, and there might have been things that spread from Easter Island, both east and west.
Cultural exchange,
Cultural exchange, exactly.
How about if we talk about Göbekli Tepe just a little bit? I'd really like to know what you think that was and why you think they buried it.
Well, let me mention the latter first. Göbekli Tepe is an incredible site in southeastern Turkey. It consists of huge stone circles. People think of Stonehenge when they think of stone circles, perhaps. Göbekli Tepe has over 20 such circles, Stonehenge-like circles, but they're not just crude stones. These are huge monoliths. Some of them are 15, 18 feet tall, weigh on the order of 10 to 15 tons, but they're not crudely carved. They're beautifully carved with nice smooth surfaces, finished edges. If people go to my website, which is www.robertschoch, ROBERTSCHOCH, www.robertschoch.com, and click on the Turkey tab, they'll see a few pictures of Göbekli Tepe.
Excellent.
But they're beautifully carved. There's sculptures in the round from Göbekli Tepe. And as I said at the beginning of the show, it goes back to the end of the last ice age. Now, they purposefully buried the site.
Are you sure of that? You sure it wasn't erosion or sediment?
I'm sorry?
You're sure that it wasn't any kind of erosion or sedimentation?
I'm absolutely sure. I looked at the stratigraphy very carefully. Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who just passed away this summer, was the archaeologist on it. He died of a heart attack unexpectedly. It's horrible. But he and I both agreed independently. You can tell when it's natural erosion, when it's natural sediment just falling in. No, they were shoveling it in. They buried it purposefully.
Wow.
Why? Before they buried it, some of the pillars got knocked down. They re-erected them hastily. They started building these crude stone walls between the pillars. I now see this as what's becoming very familiar to me around the world. At the end of the last ice age, there was this natural disaster. And
They
were
saw
trying
it
to
coming? You
fortify
think?
it. They were trying to protect themselves. And I think
Okay.
ultimately they buried it to protect it. Whether that was for posterity or maybe they thought they could come back and dig it out again, I don't know. But they re-erected pillars, put them into position, and then buried the entire thing purposefully like a time capsule.
How do you
It's really amazing.
How do you suppose they were aware that?
Professor Schmidt said before he passed away, they spent as much time burying it
Yeah.
as they did building it. Now, what was it? My best answer to you is that, and this is a term that Katie coined, it was sort of a university of the cosmos. I have found astronomical alignments there. They were looking at precession. They seem to have been orienting towards various constellations, in particular Orion and Taurus and the Pleiades, which have been very important constellations ever since. I don't buy that it was simply a temple. A lot of people say it's the world's oldest temples. Well, what do archaeologists? I'm not trying to be nasty.
No.
What do archaeologists call something when they don't know what it is? They call it either a temple or a tomb, and it's sort of a meaningless term at this point. So, yes, it probably had some religious significance, but you have to remember that in very ancient times, religion, science were not distinct and separate as many people see them now. And I think the ancients were actually correct in
more on track than we are.
having a more integrative point of view, should we say.
Okay, if I can just jump in here, I do want to mention that time is getting short. We only have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, so we're going to have to talk fast. Given that apparently they were warned, or they had some idea that there was going to be an outburst, how do you suppose they knew this?
Well, I think that they were keen observers of the skies, and I don't know that they had that much warning, because we see evidence at Göbekli Tepe that there was devastation on the site. They were then trying to rebuild it.
Oh.
They probably had to try to escape into natural underground caves initially. This is worldwide. But these solar outbursts would not, it wasn't just one huge big one and nothing after that. What you would have is a big one, then the sun would seem to calm down, then another big one would come. So there would be intervals.
And over how long a period of time?
Well, that's a good question. When you start looking at isotope data, this probably the major ones at the end of the last ice age, you would have had a huge one that really knocked things out, caused major climate changes. But even for a couple of centuries or longer, you would have had a very unstable sun that was giving off periodic bursts, should we say. And then the sun started to really calm down after some centuries and then millennia. It calmed down, slowly got less and less active. I don't want to say went in a dormant stage, but became less variable, more stable, lasted for thousands of years that way. And it was during that period, toward the end of that, about 3500 BC, that civilization reemerged. Now, I want to bring this up quickly to the present day, because we now have a very active, very volatile, very erratic sun in the present day. And I hate to say it, but there are lots of indications that the sun is starting to go into a cycle or a period which was very similar to what happened at the end of the last ice age.
Do you suppose one of the precursory events was the Carrington event in 1859?
The Carrington event in 1859, I think, is, you can use the term shot across the bow, the warning sign, you say. The Carrington event of 1859, and so getting back to your other question, there would have been probably warning shots like that at the end of the last ice age, too.
And they paid attention to
really
them.
Big one hit. But 1859, for those not familiar with it, I'll say this and try to do it in 30 seconds or so, it was a major solar outburst that caused the telegraph lines of the time to to be fried literally. Telegraph stations burnt down. It was very small from an astrophysical point of view. It was not even close to what we had at the end of the last ice age, but it was big from a modern human perspective. 1859, most people were not on electricity. Most people were not using electrical gadgets. There just wasn't much in the way of electrical gadgets. The telegraph was the main thing, and that was for only the elite. If we had a Carrington event today or tomorrow or the next year, it would be devastating to modern electrical-based civilizations. It would bring communications down, et cetera, et cetera.
Since this event is imminent, what would you suggest that we do?
I know we're running out of time. Can I make one plug here?
Sure.
I will hope people will go to my website. Again, that's www.robertschoch.com. And one thing that is really important, in my opinion, if one has the inclination and time and, lots of people like to take vacations, if one has the ability, one can go and actually see some of these sites. So I will be taking a group to Egypt, and the details are on my website. I will be taking a group to Turkey in June to see Göbekli Tepe for themselves, and also seeing all kinds of other ancient sites in Turkey. That's June. In Egypt, we'll be seeing a number of sites.
Oh, I'd love to go.
That's January in Egypt, and actually at the end of 2015, going into 2016, December, January, I'll be taking, if all goes as planned, a group to India to see the sites there.
Excellent.
All right.
And any other lectures or anything you'd like to?
I have lectures coming up. Well, the thing is, I teach at Boston University full-time, so I have to do lectures in the lecture circuit, if you would, primarily during the summer. So the summer right now for 2015 is currently being planned and scheduled, and I don't want to announce anything too prematurely and then have it change. But as those come up, we'll be posting them on the website.
All right, then.
So information about everything that you're going to be doing, the trips and everything, people can get
website.
On the website at Robert Schoch.
Yeah, and again, that's so people know how to spell my name. It's spelled S-C-H-O-C-H. So it's www.robertschoch, all one word, .com, www.robertschoch.com.
Great.
Okay, well, Dr. Schoch, we really appreciate.
Yeah,
I know it's the end of the hour. We really appreciate you coming on with us. It's been great talking to you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Time goes by quickly.
It certainly does.
It does. It does. We'll have to do it again.
And we'll have to get an update from you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, you have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So that is it. Spirit Radio, the paranormal experience for another week.
Thank you all for listening. Good night.